Rachel was packing her bags to go to the hospital again. She was sick and tired of fighting the disease, and it felt like it was never going to end. Every time she was about to begin another phase of treatment, she felt hopeless, struggling to remain calm in public. She never wondered why she had to go through this ordeal, but she wondered, when will this nightmare end? Her strength was running out. The only reason she kept trying to overcome the disease was because of her husband. Josh was supportive of Rachel from the beginning. When they learned about her disease, he was always by her side. On that fateful day, he went with her to the doctor, who told her about the terrible diagnosis. Rapid weight loss, insomnia, constant fatigue, and frequent loss of consciousness were not symptoms of stress, but of a tumor. Only after Josh forced his wife to undergo a complete examination it was possible to find out the real cause of her sickness. Sitting at the doctor's office, Rachel squeezed her husband's hand tightly. When the doctor announced her diagnosis, she looked at her husband but saw no fear or disgust in his eyes. For a moment, she felt like Josh was really scared, but he quickly pulled himself together, and it helped Rachel to calm down and believe that things would get better. At that moment, she realized that he would never leave her, and that she would fight not for her own sake, but for his. His love empowered her. The prognosis would have been much more favorable if you had been examined earlier, but unfortunately, now you have to undergo a long and serious treatment and, obviously, surgery. There is a chance of recovery, but it's very small. You have to take your courage in both hands to fight the disease, the doctor said, and Rachel pulled herself together. Her husband kept telling her, "You have to fight. We will get through this, but you have to believe in yourself. This hospital has the best doctors, and they will help you, and I will always be there for you. You know how much I love you. No matter what happens, I'll stand by you." And Rachel believed that she could overcome the disease with her husband's support. After a complex surgery, she was in the hospital for a long time, and Josh was by her side. He was always there for her, even in the toughest moments. He didn't leave her even when the chemotherapy started. He fed her when she couldn't hold a spoon. He wiped the sweat from her face when she was dying of pain and couldn't get out of bed. He bathed her when she couldn't even move. He even held her hair while she vomited. And there wasn't any disgust or fatigue in his eyes. There was only sympathy, and he was always there, repeating the same thing. "We'll get through this. You'll get through this. I'm here for you, and I'll always be here for you. I love you." And Rachel patiently went through the severe consequences of the disease and the chemotherapy, knowing she was not alone. This lasted about 6 months. The doctors did not give much hope for a full recovery. But they no longer talked about the worst outcome either. Every time Rachel hoped that the next round of chemo would be her last, but the treatment continued. And after a while, Rachel began to notice that her husband was getting tired of this way of life. She sensed some indifference in their relationship. There had been no intimacy between them for a long time. Actually, they hadn't had intimacy since the day she was diagnosed. Even though she felt she was ready for intimacy with her husband, he hesitated. "Sweetie, you need to save your strength. You're still too weak. I don't want to strain you. What if something happens? I'll blame myself. No, let's wait until you're completely healed." Rachel was embarrassed by this situation, But she didn't insist anymore and hoped that things would get better soon. Every time she went through the consequences of another round of chemotherapy, she hoped for the best, and every time she waited for the doctor to call with good news. But yesterday, her doctor called and said she had to go to the hospital for another examination, and after the examination, it will be clear whether she needs another round of chemotherapy. And Rachel lost her spirits again. But this time, her husband didn't comfort her. He just looked at her with some irritation and said shortly, "Well, what needs to be done, needs to be done." Rachel packed her bag and looked at her shaky hands in confusion. For some reason, she had a bad feeling, as if something bad was about to happen. She tried to chase the thoughts away, but she couldn't. "Are you ready? We have to go," Josh said as he peeked into the room, and they went to the hospital again. Late at night, lying on a hospital bed, she thought about what lay ahead of her and how many more ordeals she would have to face. How could she endure it when the most important person in her life, her husband, was no longer willing to support her? It would be unfair to say that he didn't care about her. Josh spent the whole day at the hospital helping his wife, but something was not right between them. "So how are you feeling?" Josh peeked into the room. "I'm fine. You've been here all day. Go home. You need to get some rest," Rachel replied, smiling at her husband. Josh looked at his watch and said, "Wow, it's so late. I didn't notice how quickly time flew by. Okay, I have to go. See you tomorrow." He kissed his wife on the forehead and left the room. Rachel was left alone. She closed her eyes, trying to fall asleep, but her anxiety didn't leave her. It seemed as if she were asleep. She was lying on the bed, and only her eyeballs were moving beneath her eyelids. For half an hour she kept her eyes closed, trying in vain to fall asleep. But when she opened her eyes with a loud sigh and said, "What the hell is this? Why is this happening to me?" she muttered. Rachel got up, readjusted her pillow, and lay down again. For 10 more minutes, she tried to fall asleep. But then she realized that she would not be able to sleep tonight. There were too many thoughts in her head, and they kept her from sleeping. Rachel wished she had taken a book from home. The sleepless night would not have seemed so long and stressful with a book. She decided to call the night shift nurse. Maybe she had some magazines. She pressed the nurse call button on the armrest of her bed and waited. Sydney was on shift tonight. Rachel liked this cheerful girl from the first day. She was very supportive and always comforted Rachel when she felt unwell. Also, Sydney had always had kind words of encouragement for Josh, believing that the patient's relatives needed support as well. Whenever Sydney was in the hospital, she would stop by to see Rachel. Sometimes she would sit down next to her, and they would have a long heart-to-heart talk. Sometimes she even stayed late after her shift to chat with her favorite patient. Mostly, Sydney would ask her about her family life and her relationship with her husband. Rachel was willing to talk about Josh for hours. During a long time of her treatment, Rachel told the nurse about all of his preferences, bad habits, character traits, and his behavior patterns. Sydney always listened very attentively to the patient. She often said that she wished she had a man as loving as Josh, who would care for her as tenderly as Josh cares for Rachel. Rachel didn't understand why the nurse listened to everything she said to her, but she needed to tell someone how grateful she was to her husband. Rachel expected a nurse to come quickly to her room, but no one showed up. Sydney should be at the nurse's station. Maybe she left the nurse's station for a minute. Then Rachel pressed the call button again, but no one came this time either. Then Rachel decided to go to the nurse's station herself. She put on her robe and walked out of the room. There was silence in the hallway. It was night, and everyone was asleep. Only a muffled cough came from one of the rooms. Rachel quietly made her way to the nurse's station, but no one was there. Maybe Sydney went to the bathroom. Rachel waited for Sydney for a few minutes and then decided to go and find her. She went to the end of the hallway to find the staff room. Perhaps she was there. As Rachel approached the staff room, she hesitantly stopped. The door was ajar. Muffled voices came from the staff room. And then she heard a man's laughter. It was strange. There were no male nurses in the hospital. Maybe Sydney was there on a date with one of the doctors who was on the night shift. In that case, Rachel shouldn't disturb them. But when Rachel was about to leave, she heard, I've run out of patience. How much longer is this going to last? I thought it would be different. Why does it take so long?" Rachel turned pale and shivered. It wasn't just the voice of some unknown man. It was the voice of her husband. What was going on? What is he doing in the staff room? He was supposed to go home hours ago. Oh, everything is so unpredictable. Some people take years to heal, and they torture their relatives all that time. I feel for you, Josh. It was Sydney. Rachel faltered and leaned her back against the wall, closed her eyes, bit her lower lip, and kept listening. "Sydney, you have no idea how hard it is for me. Each time I think, this is it, it's finally over. But here we go again. Another visit to the hospital, another round of chemotherapy. And it's like Rachel doesn't care. Anyone else would have given up long ago. But Rachel's like an iron woman, enduring everything and smiling like I'm supposed to be happy." Josh was harsh. "Darling, be patient. I don't think it's going to be much longer. It'll be over sooner or later. It's only a matter of time, I'm sure. And then you and I will be together. I'm so looking forward to it. I'm tired of waiting too, but we must be patient." Next, they declared their love and promised to be faithful to each other. After the lovers began kissing, Rachel slowly walked away from the staff room. She couldn't hear it anymore. The farther away Rachel was, the faster she walked. By the time she was near her room, she was almost running. She entered the room, closed the door, and leaned against it with her back. Her heart was beating violently. She felt like there wasn't enough air. Josh and Sydney? What a nightmare. She had always trusted him. Who knows? Maybe he had been cheating on her for a long time. She had been faithful to him, even in her thoughts. And Sydney, that witch, had found out everything about her husband so she could use it to her advantage. It took Rachel a few minutes to catch her breath, and then she lay down, covered herself with a blanket, and began to cry. She mourned her marriage, her broken love, and her worthless life. In the morning, Josh came into his wife's room. "Good morning, darling. How are you feeling?" he said cheerfully. But Rachel was sitting motionless. She looked at her husband with a frown and determination. Josh looked at her questioningly. "Josh, I decided that we should get a divorce, and I'm going to call a lawyer today to get the papers ready. We have no property to divide since we didn't buy anything during the marriage. I will keep my summer house and my apartment, and my beauty salons too. You can have the car. Please pack up and leave the apartment before I get home. I think a couple of days will be enough for you. You can ask your mistress to help you. But make sure to leave the apartment when I return. And please don't say anything. I don't want to hear a word. You don't deserve to be listened to. Thank you for being there for me during a difficult time in my life. But I don't want to be a burden to you anymore, and I can go through this without your help. Josh wanted to interrupt his wife and say something, but he turned pale and shut up after she mentioned his mistress. It wasn't the outcome he'd hoped for. He wished that his wife would pass away and he would get the inheritance. But he knew that once all the papers were signed, he would get nothing. He tried to think of what he could say to justify himself, but Rachel caught him off guard, and he couldn't say anything. And now, get out. I need to take care of my health. I'm going to recover finally, but your presence disturbs me. I've made my point. Josh stood in the doorway for a minute, not knowing what to do. But he saw the determined look in his wife's eyes and realized it was over. He walked out of the room and slammed the door hard in anger. Rachel shuddered and closed her eyes, but there were no more tears. She ran out of tears that night, and she was no longer going to think about her soon-to-be ex-husband. She was going to take care of herself. Today, the doctor came to her room and told her that she wouldn't need any more chemotherapy. She was able to overcome the disease. It had finally happened, and it gave her strength when she was thinking about the conversation she was about to have with her husband. There was a recovery period ahead, and she was ready for it. She was going to move on with her life, enjoying every moment.